going to read with me? Hello, and welcome back to our morality class. Today, we're going to continue our discussion of the fifth commandment, and we're going to do so with one of the more difficult topics. It's going to get controversial. I'm going to talk about some hard and heavy cases. I'm probably going to touch on some issues that some of you might have even had some indirect experience with. This is going to be heavy stuff. Forgive me if I'm light on the jokes today. We're going to look today at the difference between killing and letting die, and how it applies especially to medical cases, but to other difficult cases as well. So, before we begin, a brief review of some principles from previous lessons is in order. One key point we need to review is what makes an act moral versus immoral. Now, our definition for a moral act is one that leads to happiness, to right relationship, to deeply human flourishing. Now, we had criteria for what such an act would look at. One of the key points we need to reiterate, and of which we need to remind ourselves, is the idea of a moral act. Our definition for morality and for the morality of an act is human happiness. Does this action result in deep and true human flourishing, in right relationship between you and God and other people? The criteria for such an act, what we're looking for to see if an act actually is going to have that result is, well, we looked at three things we need to look at to assess the morality of an act. We looked at the moral object, what it is you're actually doing, the action and context. We looked at the intention, why you're pursuing the action you are. And we looked at the circumstances as not a make or break issue as the other two are, but as still relevant and important to the decision. A quick reminder on the most important point, you can't have a good action with a bad moral object or a bad intention. Doing a bad thing with a good motive is not good. Doing a good thing with a bad motive is not good. Neither of them is sufficient. Now, we're going to need to keep that in mind throughout today's lecture. We're going to be talking about healthcare, and I want to give the full benefit of the doubt and all charitable assumptions to all healthcare workers everywhere, so I'm not really going to talk much about bad intentions. We are, however, going to linger heavily on bad moral objects and how sometimes people try to make a decision with a good intention, but they end up doing something evil anyway. There's another key principle that we need to be reminded of before we're ready to dive into the situations and the principles we're going to talk about today. And that is our commandment to love your neighbor, to love every human being. Our definition of love, coming from Thomas Aquinas, who's really clarifying centuries of Christian thought before him, is to will the good of the other. I'm sure you guys remember that one. And we need to remember that applies to everyone. What I'm going to show you is sometimes people end up being confused or coming to the wrong conclusion, not out of a lack of love for the person, the patient, the suffering in front of them, but because they fail to remember all the other people around them who are also involved and also deserving of that high level of love, that dignity that comes from us being made in God's likeness and image. So, your actions have to be good. Good intentions aren't enough. Good ends don't justify bad means. And you have to love every human being, not just the one looking at you right now. With those principles in mind, we're going to look at some challenging cases and we're going to figure out how to navigate them. So, the fifth commandment, you shall not kill. We talked last class at length at what we mean by kill. We're talking about human life. We're talking about the end of human life by the violent and unnatural separation of body and soul, which is always a result of sin, regardless of what particular action or lack of action precipitated that result in the moment. And we're also talking about a respect for the whole body and the whole soul and the fact that they belong together. So things like assault and scandal are equally bad and problematic under this commandment. You shall not kill. However, there is a time not to kill someone, not in medical ethics, never. I mean, the very first principle is first do no harm, right? That's the idea behind the Hippocratic Oath that all doctors take. But there is a time, under certain circumstances, when the right thing to do may be to let someone die. And that's not the same as killing someone. If this sounds like I'm splitting hairs, let me show you a few examples that will tease out this difference and help us understand, on the one hand, how it's perfectly reasonable, and on the other hand, how it does fulfill our obligations to charity, as well as the strict observance of this commandment, you shall not kill. So, first example for you. And by the way, a lot of these examples are going to start with you imagining a difficult medical situation and someone who's suffering. If you're a particularly imaginative or particularly empathetic person, this might be a little difficult for you. Maybe don't imagine too hard. And please, I'm not trying to talk about any specific case that might have affected you or a family member. I am just trying to pick examples that have broad application that help us understand the principles here. So, first hypothetical. I want you to imagine someone is ill with a very serious illness, the kind that could and likely will kill them. And you have a treatment right there in front of you. It's cheap, it's effective, it almost always works, there are very few side effects, there's very little standing in between you and giving that person the cure right now. Should they receive that cure? I'm hoping at this point you're nodding your head vigorously and saying, well, duh, of course they should. And you're absolutely right. Health is a good, and to will the good of another includes willing their health, insofar as that doesn't participate in any other moral evils. Excellent so far. But now I'm going to change the scenario on you. Now I want you to imagine that the same person is ill with a different disease. And in this case, there is a treatment. But the treatment is extremely painful, extremely difficult, is going to have devastating side effects no matter what, probably isn't even going to cure them, and even if it did, the sheer expense of continuing this treatment for as long as it takes is likely to bankrupt this person and put them into utter poverty. Should you give them that cure? Well, I'm hoping at this point you're not quite nodding your head vigorously. You're right to hesitate. That's a case where maybe it's not reasonable to throw everything you've got at this one solution to this one problem. And by the way, if it sounds like I'm making up random examples, in the first case, think of things that we currently vaccinate for, like, say, smallpox. It's a cheap, easy, minimal side effect treatment that people are given preemptively from an early age. Vaccinations. For the second example, aggressive or late-stage cancer. There is a treatment, doesn't always work, and the treatment can be almost as bad as the disease, except that the treatment's not usually terminal. And if you don't have insurance, good luck. So those are the kinds of situations I'm talking about here. Now, I'm sure some of you came to the conclusion in that second scenario I gave you that, yes, you should still give this person the treatment. And you might be right. We just need to understand that that's a matter of might be. It's going to depend on the particulars. And if this feels uncomfortable to you, like I'm not caring for that patient, here's my challenge to you. Are you caring for everyone involved? See, if someone has that extreme advanced aggressive cancer in the second scenario, their whole family is going to be involved with this. Doctors, nurses, insurance companies, a hospital is going to be involved. Is it an act of charity and mercy to the family to watch this person go through chemo, even though it's probably not going to save them? Is it an act of charity to the person's family who might end up caring for that person if they do survive but can't afford the treatments? Is it an act of charity to the whole wider community if medical resources are in fact scarce and this person is going to be taking up a hospital bed for a very long time? That's a real concern right now in our medical system with the current coronavirus situation. There are reasonable circumstances under which you might decline medical care. Or as you as the patient might say, you don't need to give me all that. So, yes, you need to love the patient. And no, you don't ever kill the patient. But But you do also have to have eyes on the other people involved. It's always going to be a whole community, a whole family. How do you love all of them? First distinction we're going to introduce today is between ordinary and extraordinary medical care. Ordinary medical care is the stuff we described in the first example. It can be given to someone without huge amounts of complications, without debilitating expense or side effects. And it's good for them, and it cures them. That's ordinary medical care. That's obligatory. Every society has an obligation to make sure every member of that society has access to that ordinary medical care. Doesn't matter how they do it, free market, insurance, government provided, details are up to each society. But yes, when we say healthcare is a right, is a human right, that's what we're talking about. And it's absolutely correct. Healthcare, in that sense, is absolutely a human right. And every single human being deserves to be treated with that level of reverent respect. There is another kind of healthcare, and it's extraordinary care, or some church documents call it heroic measures. Above and beyond what's necessary, expected, reasonable, required. There are some things that might be really cool as cures. It might be really useful. But that doesn't mean everyone needs to be able to provide them to everyone all the time. There are real practical limits on what the healthcare industry can give, what people can afford, what resources are available without draining other resources, and what's charitable to the whole family. One example of this that comes to mind is a DNR. It's called a Do Not Resuscitate Order. Some people have paperwork signed, given to a family member or a lawyer or something that says, if I become basically medically dead, and it would take extraordinary measures to revive me, right? Or to put me on a breathing tube, on a long-term respirator, and there's little hope of coming back, etc. Various kinds of technicalities. Don't do it. Don't give me those extraordinary measures. It's not obligatory that everyone have one of those, but it's also not a bad thing for people to have one of those. This is where there's going to be a lot of prudence and practical application. But yes, it is reasonable under those circumstances, depending on the details, for someone to decide, it's better off if I just let this disease run its course and it take me. I'm going to die at some point anyway. There's a pragmatic realism about the fact that, yes, everyone is going to die at some point. It's not like you are defeating death with medicine. You are prolonging death with medicine. And you are, hopefully, increasing health in the meantime. First example, kill versus let die. Ordinary versus extraordinary means of healthcare. By the way, there's an important aside here. For Christians, death is not the end, and it's not the worst thing. There really are things worse than death. There is a very healthy, natural instinct to be concerned about death. To disdain death. It's of the enemy. It's not from Christ. But death is not the worst thing that can happen to a person, and death is not the end of a person. We sincerely believe we will rise on the last day when Christ comes as a matter of judgment. And that we have the opportunity to be welcomed into eternal, beautiful, joyful life with Him, where there is no sickness or death or suffering of this kind. So when we talk about end-of-life decisions, extreme healthcare, the examples we're going to talk about later, we need to have that point in mind too. There are things worse than death, which means health is not an ultimate good. There's a reason other goods sometimes outweigh life. There's a reason sometimes letting die might be the right course of action. Sin is one of those things, by the way, that's worse than death. It is much better to die without sin than to sin in a way that will rob you of that eternal life. So when we talk about these end-of-life things, keep in mind there are priorities here. And as much as keeping people alive and healthy is near the top of the list, it's not the top of the list. Sin is worse than death. Are we ready for another hypothetical example? I'm going to put you again in the position of a doctor, and you're going to be looking at a patient. This time, the patient is, again, terminal. They are dying. You are not going to prevent them from dying. Their condition has them in extreme pain. They are suffering on a daily basis, waiting to die. So what do you do? Do you let them just suffer knowing you can't cure them, so, well, that's it, game's up? Do you kill them to put them out of their misery? There's a word for that. It's called euthanasia. It comes from Greek roots, euthanos, good death. I'll dispute the validity of that etymology. I don't think that's the right answer. But that's an option some people consider. Do you give them enough drugs to get them out of pain, knowing that that dosage might still kill them? Is that different? There's a clear answer to that question, and the answer is yes. There is a moral difference between giving a patient drugs that you know will kill them with the intention of killing them, and giving a patient in extreme pain drugs that will relieve their pain and may kill them. Those are two different things. And here we're going to talk about a principle called the principle of double effect, which was, of course, first developed by none other than St. Thomas Aquinas. Told you we were never going to get rid of St. Thomas Aquinas in this course. Principle of double effect. You can perform a good action even though you know it is going to have some bad effects, as long as, well, you're willing the good, not the bad. You're not willing the good by means of the bad. And what you're doing is proportional. The good that you hope to bring out of it is equal to or superior to the bad that may result. Just because you know there's going to be one bad side effect doesn't mean you shouldn't take a good action. It's kind of the crux here. So take two parallel cases based on the last hypothetical example. One doctor says, this patient's not going to make it out of this illness no matter what. They are definitely dying, so I might as well put them out of their misery, and prescribes a huge dose of morphine that's likely to kill the patient with the deliberate intention of killing them so they can end their suffering. Euthanasia. Another doctor says, this patient is in huge amounts of pain. I cannot cure them. I can alleviate their suffering, and prescribes a similarly large amount of drugs, something like morphine, with the intent of alleviating their pain, but also hoping and praying that it does not kill them. Now, to someone who doesn't know the doctor and the patient, these two actions might look the same, but they are not. And the relationship between the doctor and the patient and the state of the soul of the doctor is going to be affected by this difference. Principle of double effect. You can perform a good action knowing that there'll be a bad result, and that is different from choosing a bad action. Again, it is wrong to kill. It is not necessarily wrong to let die. Or even, in the limited sense implied here by this example, to participate in something that hastens death. Principle of double effect. A third hypothetical example. This one's a little more technical, so I'm going to have to explain a few terms as we go on. We're going to talk about the case of an ectopic pregnancy. So first, what do we mean by pregnancy? Well, sperm from the man, egg from the woman, successfully unite, that's fertilization, and now you have a new unique genome in a zygote that develops rapidly into a fetus that implants in the uterus, that develops into, well, you and me, really. From the moment of conception, that's fertilization, not implantation, but fertilization, that's a new human being. It's got its own genes, it's got its own identity. Yes, it has a new human soul. But, in this particular hypothetical case, the the newly conceived child does not move into the uterus where it's supposed to be implanted and to grow in its mother's womb the way nature intends. Instead, it ends up, say, in the fallopian tubes, where it will not survive, where it will not get all the nutrients it needs, or unlikely, and where it is likely to cause serious medical harm to the mother and possibly even put her in a life-threatening condition. usually by continuing to grow, rupturing the fallopian tubes, and causing a massive hemorrhage, internal bleeding and such. In this case, does the doctor go in and abort, kill the child in order to save the life of the mother? Morally, the answer is absolutely not. Again, you do not kill. However, you do have to love the mother and the child, right? And that's what's wrong with abortion. It never loves the child, even if it loves the mother. You absolutely perform life-saving surgery on the woman, and that may involve the removal of the relevant fallopian tube, and yes, that's probably going to result in the death of the child, although after a certain point of viability, not necessarily. Prenatal advances in caring for children at extremely early stages in natal development is, wow, the advances in that field. You'd be amazed what the right doctors with the right tools can do to save a child who's only even a few weeks past implantation. And that technology keeps getting better and better. But anyway, do you abort? No. Do you give relevant healthcare to the mother? Absolutely. Do you perform an operation that might result in the child dying, or even will almost definitely result in the child dying? Yes. That's not the same as abortion. That's not the same as killing. That's another case of letting die. It's parallel to the last case we did. You do not kill a child. But absolutely, you do everything you can to save the mother, knowing that there's a high probability the child will die. If that's the best you can do in those cases, yes. But I want to back up for a moment and make sure we're really clear on fertilization, conception, implantation, and human life. So forgive me for a moment while I take a brief aside. The stuff I'm talking about here runs directly contrary to contemporary popular opinion in America, all the way up to the level of the Supreme Court. But I'm not wrong. When a sperm fertilizes an egg, a new human life is made. That's not a Catholic opinion, that's not a religious or even a philosophical idea, that's just good science. That new organism with its own unique genetic code and unique identity will continue to develop into a fully functioning human being. That is definitely, everyone who knows the facts agrees, a new human life. Embryology textbooks in med schools will tell you, yes, that's a life. The law doesn't necessarily recognize it as a person, but, well, I don't know if the law could give us a good definition for person. Certainly for the first 100 years of this country, it was very wrong about personal and what rights should and shouldn't go to what persons, so I don't really trust it to get this one right now. But yes, as a matter of logic, as a matter of science, a fertilized egg, a zygote, is a human life. Whether or not that has the same moral status as a human life as you and I do, well, I think so. And my ideas there are religiously and philosophically based. Because I think it's morally wrong for anyone to say, well, yes, that's a human life, but I get to judge whether or not it's a person. Ooh, that's a very dangerous power. The 20th century history is littered with regimes and nations who decided they had that power and that authority to decide which lives get extinguished and which don't. That should scare you. Also, there's a handful of people who still believe the old misinformation campaigns of the 70s that say things like, it's just a blob of cells, it's not a baby. I'm sorry, that's completely false. Take a look at an embryology textbook, take a look at line on viability and developmental charts. Babies start having a heartbeat in the first trimester. We count a human being as dead when their heart stops beating. Could we reasonably count a human being as being alive medically when their heart starts beating? That would rule out most of abortion practice in this country. Yeah. There's another big political misconception, and it's this. There are people who, whether through misinformation campaigns or through honest misunderstanding, think that being opposed to abortion in every case means you intend to deny pregnant mothers health care that just might hurt the baby. That's totally incorrect. That is not what anyone who is anti-abortion means by that term. What they mean is this: you don't murder the child. There might be cases where you need to let it die. That's reasonable medicine in a hard case. But that's not the same as actively killing it. Keep that distinction in mind. Anti-abortion does not mean anti-woman's health care or anti-mother's health care. I sincerely believe abortion doesn't even count as health care. Health care has the end of helping at least one person get healthier and live longer. Abortion literally always has the end of making sure one person stops living immediately. Even if it might be beneficial for the health of the mother, which is, much more complicated medical claim. Yeah. For those of you who sincerely believe that the termination of a pregnancy, the taking away of a life of a newly conceived child, should be a constitutionally protected right, I wonder on what grounds. And I wonder how well informed you are about the actual biological knowledge, the scientific knowledge about the development of children in the womb. And I would encourage you, before you harden your opinions on that on a political basis, to do some good scientific research, to learn the facts, and then form your opinion. By the way, if I said anything offensive or controversial, I apologize. It's not my intention. And feel free to bring it up in our chat in the live stream later. I really do want to hear from you. And if I'm incorrect, please show me where. My life would be much easier if I didn't feel logically and conscientiously compelled to be anti-abortion in literally every case ever. So if you can prove something I haven't seen before, good for you. But yeah, can't ignore that issue. It'd be a matter of scandal. Anyway. So, quick review. The big principle at work here that we need to have in mind when we talk about these bioethics hard medical cases is that it is wrong to kill. It's not necessarily wrong to let die. That the distinguishing thing needs to be charity towards all people involved. And that there is room for actions with double effect. You can intend the good outcomes of something, as long as you're not doing anything evil and not intending the evil side effect, which you'd really rather avoid. It helps if you're willing to take some action to avoid that secondary effect, by the way. We looked at the basic idea of ordinary versus extraordinary care. We looked at why euthanasia and abortion are always wrong, and also how they're often misconstrued. I'm going to cut it there. I know it's a little short for one of our lectures, but I'm sure there's going to be some very interesting Q&A and discussion in the chat, which I'm really looking forward to. Thank you so much for tuning in. See you soon. God bless.